Well, welcome to this episode of Ordinary People Pursuing an Extraordinary Path. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Kyle Kowalski from Sloww. And we're going to just talk a little bit about the journey Kyle's been on and where he is now and how that happened and what maybe insights there are for other people looking to go on a less ordinary path. So to start with, Kyle, could you tell me a little bit, like, what are you doing now? Like, what do can you share with the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, I guess I am the founder of a website called Sloww, and you can find it at slow.co, two W's, it's extra slow. But the way that I describe it is Sloww exists to share the art of living with students of life. So what I've found myself doing over the last decade is kind of a self-described student of life myself, or a lifelong learner. And what I'm doing is essentially sharing everything that I've learned through my, what you could call like a public digital commonplace book of all the books that I'm reading, the people and projects I'm discovering, the insights, the life transformation, all those different types of things I'm sharing through articles and different products and things like that through the Sloww website. So this took me the better part of a decade to be able to put my purpose into a sentence, a single sentence. But the way that I describe it now is that I synthesize lifelong learning that catalyzes deeper development. And that's a play on words. That's both what I feel like I'm doing for myself and what I also offer to others through the Sloww website. So the way that comes to life is, I think at this point, Sloww as a website is actually approaching 700 posts or articles on the website. And that includes like 200 email newsletters, 150 book summaries of books across like an interdisciplinary approach to things. So everything from intentional living to life purpose to mental mastery and psychology, biology, even into like spirituality, consciousness, metaphysics, and things like that. So I really try to take a holistic interdisciplinary approach to life itself, and then share what I learn along the way. So that's how things have evolved. Of course, there have been a number of different stages and phases over the course of a decade to get to this point, but how that comes to life for other people is obviously all of the publicly available information through hundreds and hundreds of posts on the website. But then I also offer some things that are deeper syntheses that I offer through like a premium membership. I have some digital products that go deeper into things. So if you're someone who really wants to dive deep into the art of living, I do have some ways that you can do that. But a lot of it is publicly available. And it's just, again, sharing kind of like the breadcrumbs of the journey that I feel like I've gone through to this point.
And so you spent a decade kind of in this. And, you know, how does is this how you started? I mean, like, take me back then. What were you doing before you went on this journey a decade ago?
Yeah, so Sloww got kicked off in late 2015, unknowingly or unconsciously, through what I call a self-diagnosed existential crisis. So I had been working at this point in late 2015 in the marketing and advertising industry for 8 years. And if anyone's familiar with the marketing and advertising industry, and if you've been an employee in that world, then you know that that industry is known for its ebbs and flows of high-hour work weeks and things like that. Burnout is not uncommon in the marketing and advertising industry. So what happened for me was 8 years into my career, I was on my fourth marketing company, and I was working 60 to 80-hour work weeks for 6+ months straight. And the combination of that plus the job that I was working at, which was a global apparel and fashion company, was a 1-2 punch of burnout with the high hours and lack of purpose, essentially marketing and selling people more stuff that they didn't need. So the combination of both of those together led to what I described as like a self-diagnosed existential crisis, and the acute portion of that was like 6 weeks at the end of 2015. And that kicked everything off. For me, that was literally when all the questioning started. So up to that point in my life, and at that point I was 30 years old, up to that point in my life, I had lived the normal Western socialized conditioned life of, go to school, get the job, get the salary, get the better job or get promoted, jump to a different job, make more money, spend more money, the whole lifestyle inflation circle of work, spend, repeat. Upgrade your house, upgrade your car, upgrade your clothes, the whole deal. I hadn't questioned a thing. That was just the water that I was swimming in for the first 30 years of my life. But the crisis kicked everything off in terms of me, at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, staring at my ceiling, my heart racing, and starting to ask the deeper questions about, am I really here for this short time to do this? And if not, then what am I here to do? Another example of a question that I was asking myself at the time was, am I really killing myself with work to sell people more stuff they don't need? And so those were kind of the first gateway or wedge in my mind that really cracked open a door of starting to ask the questions of, well, if it's not this, then what is this? What is purpose? What is my purpose? What does purpose even mean? How do I find more meaning in my life? How do I more deeply connect with life? And so those 6 weeks of like an acute existential crisis kicked everything off. And then the following couple years, I really dug into concepts like intentional living. This is why Sloww is called Sloww in the first place, was because I discovered slow living as an intentional living concept, as really an antidote to the busyness or the workaholicness of the life I had been living in the marketing industry. And so I saw it as a as a way out, or as an escape, or an antidote to leave that life behind, or possibly leave that life behind. And so all things intentional living were the very first things that I discovered, because it was so alternative and contrarian to how I had been living for, the better part of my life up to that point. So this is when I discovered, oh, go ahead.
Just tell me, what is intentional living, just for people listening? Or I can see the room behind you, and it's like just got a tree, a small internal tree, one picture, what looks like a beautiful chair. Is that, yeah? Tell me a bit about that, what that is.
Yeah, so I guess you could consider this minimalism, a form of minimalism behind me. But this is actually, I'm glad you asked, because this is an important distinction in terms of like the minimalist aesthetic, which is what you could call this, and like a more minimalist like lifestyle design, or simple living lifestyle design. So for me, while I do like the minimalist aesthetic, the lifestyle is actually more important for me in terms of I use intentional living as like an umbrella concept that underneath has simple living, slow living, voluntary simplicity, minimalism, digital minimalism, decluttering, lifestyle design, financial independence. All of these types of concepts I would group under intentional living itself. And the easy way to think about simple living and slow living, they're not technically synonymous. People have an idea when you say simple living of what that is. They think of things like minimalism and your physical relationship with your physical stuff, and whether you have a bunch of like physical clutter, and you're spending a bunch of money, like the whole hedonic treadmill of lifestyle inflation and all of that. But with slow living, what simple living could be for your physical space, slow living could be the other side of the coin in terms of your relationship with your time. So you have both your space and time aspects. So not only did I kind of start cutting expenses and spending and things like that on a physical scale in terms of what I own on the simple living side, but I also started analyzing, why am I so busy? Why is my mind why is my mind cluttered? Why is my relationship with time cluttered? Why do I feel like I have no time in my day and I'm just a busyaholic and things like that? So you start to look at both of those sides, the simple and the slow sides. And that's really where intentional living started to take off for me. And what that did, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, well, to keep going. So that when that took off for you, yeah.
Yeah, when that took off for me, what that did, and again, I didn't know this when I was in the midst of it, this was more upon reflection, but that opened up internal space for me. And that internal space that opened up for me allowed me to start going into trying to discover purpose for myself. And so those following couple years after the existential crisis were really when I started getting into, I was spending all my free time. I was still employed at this point for the next 2.5 years after my crisis, but I was using all of my free time outside of my workday to literally start mapping out. My office at home at the time had whiteboard paint walls. And so I was literally like taking notes and mind mapping and doing all these brainstorming things on all of the walls of my office at the time of what is purpose? What could my purpose be? It's that whole get to know thyself process, at least on the level of your own mind and your psychology. That's where I really went deep into all of that. But I couldn't really have done that had I not opened up some internal space to even be able to reflect upon, my own mind at that point in time. And then in a nutshell, that led to getting to know myself psychologically, which led into all things psychology, even beyond my own individual mind. And then that led into what I call spiritual seeing, or things that could be considered beyond mind. And when I use the word spirituality, I don't mean anything woo-woo or new age or anything like that. The way that I define spirituality, to the extent that you can, is seeing who you are beyond mind and self in your own direct experience. And so it was kind of as simple as that for me. But again, I didn't realize that until, years later upon reflection. But those are kind of some of the stages or phases that I feel like I've gone through over the last decade.
So if I could go back, I want to look at a couple of things. First, in this moment, so there might be many people listening. I think I look at even in my own life where I might have had the beginnings of these insights. Like you were sitting there at 2 or 3, and you could easily have had that, felt pretty rubbish, but gone back to work, or and it kind of become, okay, you're not that happy, but it just goes on for years. What actually happened around that moment? So you had that insight, you're looking at the ceiling. What steps did you go quit your job? Like what actually were the mechanics? Like how did you start down this path, which has led you to kind of quite out of the ordinary situation in both what you're doing, how you organize your time, even the space in the room behind you? Just going back to that moment, what happened? Did you stop the job at the selling the jeans, or yeah, what actually occurred?
Yeah, so that's a great question because you're absolutely right. So in prior jobs during my career, what I realize now is that I had one of the 1-2 punches, but never the knockout at the same time. So I had worked on everything from business to consumer products, business to business products, pharma products, even you name it. So it wasn't necessarily in prior jobs that I had found the work purposeful, but I didn't have the other punch of burnout at the same time. Or on the flip side, I had some of the high hours, but maybe the projects I was working on with those high hours were actually things that I felt more purposeful or meaning around. So it wasn't until that final job where it was the combination of both. It was the sustained burnout for, 60 to 80 plus hour work weeks for 6+ months straight. Plus, I just could not find any purpose or meaning. I didn't personally care whether one more person bought another pair of $20 jeans or not. So and the way that I describe it at the time, just to put it in like a provocative sentence or in the extreme, is like I was making, $200,000 a year to manage a $20 million a year marketing budget to sell people more $20 products. And so you see the extremes of that, right? Like I was getting paid all this money to sell people more cheap products that they didn't need. Like how many pairs of jeans does anybody need? I actually could get free jeans at this company and I only owned 1 or 2 pair of jeans even though I could get them for free. So I guess my minimalist seeds were being planted even when I could have gotten free stuff. But yeah, it still wasn't an easy decision to quit my career. So what happened was the crisis happened and then I continued to work in that same job in that career for 2.5 years after that. And I describe those years as actually rougher than the crisis itself. Those were 2.5 years of what I call increasing cognitive dissonance. So what I was doing was I was showing up to my, typical 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 job, plus all the extra work outside of work hours. But in my free time, like I said, I was learning all these things about myself, about humans, about life, you name it. And what happened was the cognitive dissonance just built and built and built, where I was learning all these things, but I was still living and showing up to life in the same way that I had been. And my mind, the dissonance in my mind just built to a critical mass or tipping point or boiling point, breaking point of it just, my mind wouldn't allow it anymore. The things I was learning were too far offset with how I was still showing up and living day in and day out that it just reached that breaking point. And I decided that I always had like an entrepreneurial bug or entrepreneurial spirit and had tried, dabbled in other, side projects and side businesses over the course of my career even. But I finally decided, okay, if I'm ever going to try this entrepreneurial thing and take the leap, now is the time to take the leap. But even months before quitting my career, I was applying to other jobs in that same career and whatever, and it just happened to work out where I was kind of forced into a corner with no plan B because the final job that I applied for, I didn't even get an interview for. I just got flat out rejected. So it was one of those things where I was like, okay, well, any other job that I feel like I'm interested in, I don't have that option for, and so it's like I'm out of options. There is no plan B, and I can't do this anymore because the dissonance has built up so much. I got to go try this entrepreneurship thing. And here we are. Actually, last month was the 6-year anniversary of me quitting my career. And so here we are, yeah, 6 years later, and I wouldn't change a thing.
That's incredible. And I think it's also beautiful that your option was taken away. I see that in my own life. I think some of misfortune that happened to me was applying for something I didn't really want and kind of getting it, which was a research fellowship once in my life. And I was like, I look back and be like, okay, I wish I hadn't got it. And my great good fortune, I was trying to become an academic. I didn't want to be an academic. And when my paper got rejected, a bit like your job, it was like, I remember being like really both kind of gutted because you're still like, oh my God, my paper got rejected, but actually delighted. I remember that moment being like, oh, I now, I'm free kind of aspect. So that's fascinating that you share that. And I really resonate. So
Yeah,
I just asked, so
you never know when your bad luck will turn into good luck, right?
yes. Well, there's a classic, the horse story from, Buddha,
Exactly.
the story
Yeah.
of the horse, the horse runs away, it comes back, etc. So that's amazing. So you still stayed there. But the other thing that's amazing, could you say a bit like, what was it you started reading? Because the other way that story could have gone is like, you have the insight, but you have to keep working your job. You need the money, or it's just too, and then, slowly, you get promoted or it go, whatever. But you were saying like, you were doing all this stuff outside of work, so the cognitive dissonance was building. What was it, the kind of stuff you initially started reading or like just doing that kind of sustained you in that path while still doing the job?
Yeah, so during my career, I describe it as like I was a walking zombie. Like I was so far detached from life. I also describe it as like, I was the typical high achiever in school, in sports, and in my career. And then I realized during this crisis that I had failed the most important subject of all, which is life itself. And so it finally dawned on me that like, you can game, school and sports and work and all these things and still, you could have made it on paper, which is what anyone outside an external observer would say, like, oh, you've got the resume and the job title and the salary and the house and the car and the clothes and all these things, but I was completely empty and dead inside. I had failed life. And it finally occurred to me that that was the case. And so what I was really trying to do was reconnect with life on a deeper level. And so I found myself in my free time, I was rewatching Planet Earth. I was rewatching the Cosmos series. I was trying to I couldn't have articulated this to you, during the crisis itself, but what I was trying to do, it's clear now, is trying to more deeply reconnect with life itself. I had been so disconnected in like a zombie-like state of just showing up to this career that wasn't meaningful for me, that I was looking for anything and everything. I wish I had my Google search history at the time, because what I did was I ended up saving a Google Doc that I shared with some family and friends that I titled How to Have an Existential Crisis. And it ended up being over 30 pages of a Google Doc of all of my notes. This was when I first started getting into like note taking, in a sense of I'm searching anything and everything on Google and I'm saving all the things I'm learning about humans, about how old the planet is, about space, about how our bodies and brains work, about how all of these things that were starting to give me a newfound perspective on myself, of others, and the world at large that I just had not connected with in maybe ever. And so it was like the first time in the beginning of my 30s where I really started to reconnect with life, or connect with life for the first time in a new way. And so it was a lot of documentaries, a lot of trying to reconnect with nature, a lot of just this is when the questioning and searching process really started. Again, this is another thing that I couldn't have articulated at the time, but what I realize now is everything that I've been doing over the last 10 years has been this repeated flywheel of questioning to learning to developing, which leads to ever deeper questioning to learning to developing to questioning to learning to developing. And so that's really what I've been doing, is I've just been following what I'm trying to listen to life and what life is telling me. And that's where suffering can be a great catalyst for transformation, is if you actually pause and try to listen to what life is telling you, then you can utilize that as like some like doubt that's entering your mind, some skepticism, maybe a newfound perspective. And then you start searching about that. You question, you search, you learn more about it. And then that learning can lead to what could be called psychological development or vertical development or just human development in general, where that gives you a newfound perspective transformation, which then allows you to question things in a new way. And you just kind of repeat that lifelong learning flywheel. And that's what I feel like I've been doing really over the last decade. It's a form of, in spirituality, that's called self-inquiry, asking the question, who am I? And what I've realized over the years is that, or the different stages or phases, is that how I would answer that question, who am I, is very different now versus 2 years ago, 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. You move from defining yourself by your resume and your job title and your net worth and all those external kind of societal factors to more of the internal, and then ultimately beyond even how your own mind can describe it. So yeah, it's just been an ongoing journey of self-inquiry in some way, shape, or form.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I'd like maybe to just go a bit more there, and then there's a question I'll come back to. I mean, this, we talked about before, about describing that there are also, maybe for listeners, some of them may be very familiar, some may not, but this idea that both obviously in the spiritual dimension, but this idea of kind of ego development, or the kind of self, um, people like Susan Cook-Greuter, um, Robert Keegan, others. You want to say, because you were saying like that aspect where you defined yourself. So 10 years ago, you go back to that job, it would be based on basically the societal conventional things, what you earned, what job title you had, etc. And how would you describe that from what you know now? Yeah, and what kind of the terms you'd see it as? Is this kind of evolution of your
Mm.
self, and even transcending the self, development?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess I'm a huge fan of Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory of all of. Actually, recently read Ken Wilber's Integral Psychology, where his appendix of that book has like 100+ human development models listed. Cook-Greuter and Jane Levenger being one of those in terms of ego development. But that's the one that has resonated the most with me because it's all oriented around your sense of self or your identity or your ego. And then everything else kind of comes as a byproduct of that. How you see yourself and others in the world, everything else in terms of your behavior, what you say, how you act, all those things are kind of a byproduct. But the benefit, and one of the reasons why it resonates so much with me, is that I didn't find ego development theory until years into this journey. And so it wasn't an example of like a self-fulfilling prophecy of me discovering this map and then trying to live according to the map. It was more of like I was living, kind of stumbling and living and learning the hard way through everything. Then I discover this thing and I'm like, oh my gosh, this finally gives me words and concepts to articulate something that I already intuitively knew and had a felt sense of because I had lived through it. But I didn't even know that that existed. So it was that kind of great synchronicity, if you will, of like seeing something that so closely matches your lived experience. And I've had other people reach out to me about ego development theory because they're like, I completely agree. Like when I discovered it, it mapped to my own journey so closely. It was amazing. But for me, what I now realize, and the words that I can use to articulate it now are, oh, my crisis was the watershed of moving or beginning to move from the conventional stages of development to the post-conventional stages of development. So the crisis really started kicking things off for that. The intentional living is interesting because in Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory model, you move from what she calls self-determining, which is like the peak stage of how what the West socializes humans of you're a self-made person and you're an achiever and you're gonna, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and do it all yourself and you're ultimately solely responsible for it with your own free will and all these things. That is kind of the peak of the conventional stage of it's all up to you and your own discipline and grit and perseverance and everything else. And I had certainly lived through that. And then you move into the post-conventional stages, and the very first post-conventional stage that Suzanne talks about is self-questioning, which is amazing because that's where you get into, wait, how did I get this socialized mind in the first place? Why does my mind work the way it does at all? Like, why do I think in English? Why, like, this is the language that I was socialized and conditioned with. Where did all my ideas come from? So that's when things really get interesting. And to your point, you had mentioned Keegan. In Keegan's theory of adult development, he has a subject-object relationship theory within that, where this is a little bit of a mouthful and won't make sense to a lot of people who aren't familiar with it, but the idea is when you move to a new stage of development, the subject of the prior stage becomes the object of the next stage. An easy way to kind of think about that is a lot of people in the conventional stages are still identified with their mind, or their identity is their ideas. It's like one and the same. They're subject to their own mind. But once you move to the post-conventional stages, you're now aware of your mind, and you can observe and witness your mind. And so therefore, you can self-question your mind and reflect upon it and things like that. So that's when things really get interesting. And to me, that's when, I mean, in spiritual terms, that's what you could call awakening. Once you no longer are identified with your mind, which is just a product of your socialization and conditioning in the first place, then you're aware of the mind and you can observe and witness it. So everything kind of aligns for me, and it all kind of hinges on the subject-object relationship. If people are listening, don't understand this, I actually have some posts on the Sloww website about it. I have a post about like horizontal and vertical development 101, which is a good starter spot. But and it didn't click with me. So if it doesn't make sense for people, it didn't click with me initially at first. But once it does, it is completely eye-opening in terms of how what you're subject to is just invisible to you. It's your filter or lens on reality in the world. But then once that becomes object, then you can be aware of it, question it, reflect on it, etc. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And that's actually perfect bridge to my question I wanted to come to next to it was like a little bit about your upbringing. I mean, like, where did the original Kyle come from? And maybe both what formed the conventional, but also maybe plant any seeds of this. And now, also like, yeah, I'll come to another question follows, but like, your family, often it's interesting, like, yes, something happened to you, but like, I have brothers or sisters or your parents who don't really get what's going on at all. Like, what are you doing? Quitting your marketing job. But maybe to start with, is there anything, tell me a bit about your upbringing, if that's okay, about
Yeah.
how did the original get formed?
Yeah, so I've actually done a ton of thinking about this to the point where I feel like I've even dissected 50 plus characteristics about myself. I call it the lottery of birth or the birth lottery. There are other terms like the ovarian lottery and things like that of, how did I ever become me in the first place or what I considered me, for the vast majority of my life. And so on this lottery of birth post, I kind of dissect every single thing about me. Like, did I choose my genes? Did I choose my brain? Did I choose any cell in my body? Did I choose my parents or where I was born and things like that? So for me, that comes down to I got a really lucky lottery of birth ticket, and I can now, appreciate that and humbly acknowledge it because I was born in the 1980s in, middle class Midwestern USA family with married parents and two younger siblings and went to a private Catholic high school and Jesuit or private Catholic grade school and Jesuit high school. And, I can see all these things now in life that conditioned and socialized me in a certain way that are still playing out even to this day. A lot of people think your childhood is something that you just, lived in the past and it's no longer affecting you as an adult, but it affects everything, as an adult. Um, and so for me, it was really getting a newfound appreciation for how lucky of a lottery ticket I had been dealt, essentially, of all of that. But in terms of how I'm wired, so I was a hardcore introvert my entire childhood growing up until like mid high school, to the point I was so shy and introverted that I even had family, like cousins, ask if I was mute because I just like wouldn't speak. And then I met two of the most outgoing people I had ever met in my entire life in high school, and that completely changed in terms of how my introverted personality comes to life. But and the other part was I had this fear of disappointing my parents, but it wasn't because my parents said, you better not disappoint us. It was something that I just got it out of the water, that I was living in of, oh, I better not disappoint my parents, which meant I better do really well in school. I better get straight A's. I better excel at sports and try really hard. So that whole kind of achiever mindset of hard work ethic and all of that played out through school and sports and ultimately my career even in terms of, and I didn't realize this until years later either, that my self-worth was directly tied to my work. So whether that was getting good grades or doing well in sports or getting a job or getting promoted or whatever it was, my self-worth was directly tied to that. And if anyone's familiar with like the Enneagram work, I'm somewhere between like a type 3 achiever and a type 5 investigator, but the ultimate fears of both of those types are one of them is being useless and the other one is being worthless. And so they're almost kind of the same thing in terms of the greatest fear of that type, which was the same thing for me of, oh, my self-worth is wrapped up in what I'm doing in the world and how I feel like I'm giving, myself to the world. And if I'm not doing these things, then I don't feel useful or worthy as a human. And so that took, 30 plus years to kind of unravel for me of, oh, okay, this is why I work so hard because of my self-worth is wrapped up in it. But that's a lot. So, and I mean, there are other things in terms of my childhood. Like, I thought I was going to go into graphic design. I come from like a very artistic, like visual arts family. My dad's an industrial designer. All my cousins are graphic designers. I thought I was going to go into like the graphic design route, but I was up until the wee hours of the morning doing art projects in high school. And so I don't think that was going to fly. It's that whole perfectionist mindset. Um, so yeah, so a lot of that kind of paved the way for me. In terms of all the spiritual side, though, like being raised Catholic, going to a Jesuit high school and all that, that kind of indoctrination never stuck with me. It was almost like is like Catholic mass was so uninteresting to me that it's just like you almost, and because I was introverted, I was constantly in my head. So it was like, you'd go to church or mass or whatever and you would just zone out. And so it was like the indoctrination didn't really stick. And I didn't rediscover spirituality until I actually met my wife in my 20s, where she introduced me to non-denominational Christianity, which I had no idea even existed. Wait, you're telling me you can go to church and there's like a band and like a pastor that's not a priest and they're not just repeating the same things over and over again every single week? That was a completely different world for me that I didn't even know existed. And then, of course, now in my later 30s, discovering all things spirituality in terms of like Eastern spirituality and like the direct path and Advaita Vedanta and all of these different spiritual traditions. What I now do these days is I'm more of a spiritual synthesizer in terms of I'm looking across East and West, I'm looking across modern and ancient, and I'm trying to find like the core essence of what everything points to. So in a sense, it's kind of like the perennial philosophy or perennial wisdom, similar to kind of like what Ken Wilber does in terms of trying to take all these things and figure out like the foundations or the essence of them, of what they're all pointing to in some way, shape, or form, in just very different words. That's kind of what I feel like I'm doing now in terms of spirituality. But I would have never guessed in a million years that I would have ended up in something spirituality related, 10 plus years ago.
And what can I ask? What happened when your moment of like shifting career and like taking this, starting, particularly when you actually then left your job and this kind of manifested? How was it with your, like, whether your family or your work colleagues? I mean, did you ever talk to any of them, or your partner? Like, how did it land? How did people, and has anyone else that gone on this path, like out of your stuff? But starting maybe like, what was the reaction of family or work colleagues or stuff to this question?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because it's different for each person that you run it by. So, for instance, my wife had seen me through my career, and I think by the time I had my crisis, which was in 2015, we were about 5 or 6 years into our relationship at that point and had been married for like 4 years. And so she even says, like, your crisis, like, I had never seen you like that before. Like, it was, I'm not gonna, sugarcoat it, that it was, the crisis itself was a dark time for sure. And then the following 2.5 years almost were like an even more of like a wearing down of like, this isn't, I just can't keep doing this. And she just heard me complaining and frustrated every single day of the job and everything else. And so I think, and I had been working on side businesses and passion projects for a decade, where she knew I was interested in entrepreneurship and wanted to give it a try and things like that. So for my wife specifically, who's the closest to all of this, that was almost like a wearing down of, I just got to take this leap and give it a try. And if it doesn't work, at least I got it out of my system, because entrepreneurship is never a guarantee, right? So I just knew I had to give it a try. And I think 2.5 years is post-crisis and all the frustration and complaining and burnout and everything still and lack of purpose, it finally wore her down enough to say, okay, yes, like, you're so unhappy doing this career, like, just give this thing a try. The other thing was I agreed to do all of the housework. So that was the thing, if I'm going to have a flexible schedule being an entrepreneur, then I'm going to do everything with all the chores, all of the housework, the cooking, the cleaning, the vacuuming, the laundry, the everything, to take that burden off of her, because she still works, a typical career. And she's almost 15 years into her own career at this point and is still doing it. So that was another thing that, if someone else is going through this and is in a relationship with a partner or a spouse or something, that is a way that you could maybe negotiate to say, hey, I'm going to be making less money, at least from the get-go, but I'll take on all of the other stuff that neither of us want to do necessarily. In terms of my parents, I think my mom said, they're both ultimately supportive. My parents are actually two of the coolest people that I know, and very laid back and go with the flow people. But my dad was an entrepreneur for decades in like the industrial design robotics, like physical robotics space. And so he kind of got it a little bit. And then I think my mom said something like, no one in our family is allowed to quit a job without having another job already lined up or something like that. And so that was a little bit, yeah. that was a little bit more in terms of the money side of it, of like, what exactly are you doing? And I've heard this from so many other people that have quit what they were doing to go into like solopreneurship or entrepreneurship or whatever it may be. Like your parents are just of a generation, a different generation for the most part, and it doesn't necessarily resonate with them. And then for friends and family, yeah, it's another
Right,
case
but
of like a,
just
yeah.
just one thing there. I think that's very powerful. I mean, it's powerful for me. I think to emphasize that it is at those moments often the background that maybe has never been said
Mm,
of the expectation and the conditioning of the conventional self show up.
yeah, yeah.
So in my case, it's like many years later, like my parents were amazing to me, um, so loving, and kind of generally always said like, do what you know, we just want you to be happy. That what my father would say. But my father was a successful lawyer. My mother was kind of different, became kind of a farmer. But it was definitely from a background of like, there was a point where I basically didn't do my maths PhD. And I remember being like, oh, I just want to have this year. Like, she's like, but what are you doing that? Shouldn't you be getting a master's? Shouldn't you be on some path? And it was very subtle and very loving. It didn't come from any kind of,
Hmm.
but you suddenly see the own conditioning. I mean, later on, at
Hmm.
least, you can have this incredible compassion of like, just like I'm conditioned and I was in this conventional mind, that's true of many other people, around me, including my parents. But I just want to emphasize that because I think the thing that I would say for my life was maybe it wasn't immediately financial, but there was like, oh, you should be making even a contribution, or you're kind of a bit like, if you're not working or like properly in this way, you know, you're a bit of a, you're a bit, you're not doing what you should do. And I think when you said that, like what you said for your mom, I can imagine that wasn't, it wasn't unloving. She was
Oh, of
concerned for
course.
you, but it was
Yep.
totally at the same time. It's a moment when, it must have been like difficult, a little, not difficult, but like, touch something, because you already had that energy in you of like, oh, so I guess those are the moments I think we see the way, what I notice is how hard it is. So one of the reasons I'm running this podcast, I see that many people, including myself, have multiply actually lapsed from like knowing even in my heart I want to do something different, or that I was not fulfilled, or that I really had a yearning to see the deeper way, and then not did it for at least some period of time.
Hmm.
And what I think is that one of the things is not just, oh, I need to earn money, but it's often the expectations of particularly of those closest to us that kind of keeps us there. And so I think it's worth acknowledging that, and also how, you skill, in your case, you were becoming an entrepreneur. You weren't saying, hey, I'm going off to find my purpose in life, although that was what was partly going on. You were like, oh, I'm going to become an entrepreneur. What kind of entrepreneur were you going to become at that point, did you say to them or to your family or
Yeah,
to your
so
wife?
this is where it's kind of funny because my intention, so I had been working on, well, during my career, the last job of my career, I was working at a global apparel and fashion brand. And then I had been building essentially an e-commerce lifestyle brand that was going to sell physical products like graphic t-shirts and, who knows what else other physical products that I would ship to people through an e-commerce website that was completely built. It was, the whole thing was done. I had 3 trademarks approved. The entire site was built on Shopify. I had 100 products concepted. I had been working on this side thing for a decade. And so my plan the day after I quit my career was I'm going to spend half my day working on that thing and then half of my day on Sloww. And then what I realized after like a week was this is not going to work. I can't do both of them. I'm going to have to choose one. And when I ran it through like the pros and the cons and everything else, what I realized was, okay, it actually, this is another example of, to your point, like the farmer who loses his horse and good luck, bad luck, and what it may be is the fact that I had been working on this like side lifestyle e-commerce brand, but then my career, I found no purpose or meaning in the fashion and apparel industry. And I saw how dirty that industry was and how low the profit margins are and everything else along with it. That actually helped me realize, oh, that's the thing I had been working on the side for a decade actually isn't going to be my thing going forward because of the last job I had in my career. So what I ended up doing, and not to mention what I realized was if I'm working on this lifestyle apparel brand, then I'm going to have to spend all my free time doing all of the searching, learning, and developing that I want to be doing still through Sloww on the side. Like that's going to have to become its own side project then. And what I ultimately did was I just put the entire thing I had been working on for a decade on the back burner. and went all in on Sloww. And I said, I'm just going to make the questioning and learning and developing and all things Sloww the primary focus. So that way I don't have to do it on the side. It's going to be the main thing. And I'm going to just share everything that I'm learning. So what I realized is that, and not to mention, since I didn't actually go into graphic design, I don't have the skill sets to actually like create the physical product designs. I would have to outsource that to a designer in some way, shape, or form. Whereas with Sloww, I have the primary synthesizing skills and digital information skills and just general digital marketing skills to be able to do everything Sloww as a true solopreneurship. I don't have to outsource anything. So that was an eye-opening thing of realizing, okay, I'm not going to go into e-commerce, I'm going to go into d-commerce or digital commerce, where everything is focused on information and informational products instead of physical products. So all of that, it's just funny how you have to, in a lot of cases, you just have to live and learn the hard way. I think I had already tried at least 4 or 5 different entrepreneurial things over the course of my career even. And then the side clothing thing was the main one. And then ultimately it all led and pointed to Sloww as like the main thing that I wanted to go in on. But yeah.
But one question, what was great is you had this story at least for your parents and others to get you off their back that I'm doing this. If you pitch them, you're like, I'm going to go do this slow, digital thing. It might have been a tougher sell in a bit or not. I don't know. Like what I mean is like, what would your mother have said if you said, oh no, I'm actually stopping this incredible job, to investigate the meaning of life. I wonder what she would have said.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that would have flown a little bit less. For instance, there's a friend of mine, his name's Paul Millard, and he wrote a book called The Pathless Path, and our journeys overlap like 80% is similar. He was in like high paid consulting work and didn't find it meaningful, but the difference is I knew I started working on Sloww the day after I quit my career. Like I woke up early the next morning and I got right down to work on it because I had already launched it pre quitting my career. And for him, though, he didn't know what he wanted to do. And so he calls it the pathless path, and some people call it like gap years or sabbatical years or whatever. But in his case, it wasn't just a gap year. It was, I'm quitting my career and I don't know what I want to do. And so he quit his career and he had to do some international travel and things like that. And so when he quit, that's when he got into the deeper purpose finding journey itself. But for me, a lot of that happened during my cognitive dissonance years. I kind of created the plan of what I wanted to go into next. And so for me, it was, one day I was in my career and then the next day I was in entrepreneurship and it was overnight. There was that change. I knew exactly what I wanted to go into. But yeah, that's another thing that people struggle with is, if they know for sure that the thing they're doing isn't the thing, but they don't know what they want to do yet, they might do that pathless path route where they just quit their career or job or whatever it may be. And then they spend some time without something trying to figure out, well, what is next? And for me, I had to do that I did that from like a directional perspective. I could have never put my purpose in a sentence until the last 2 or 3 years, maybe. But what I knew was directionally, I want to go in this direction. And so like this is like where you're kind of listening to life of like, I know this thing that I'm currently doing doesn't resonate. Life is kind of pulling me in this direction over here that resonates more. I can't really articulate yet what that is, but directionally, I know this is where I want to go. And so I'm going to follow that and see where it goes. And so that's kind of how it played out for me.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for sharing the journey. And I think it's really also inspiration. It's a good example here of like, I suppose a disciplined traversal. There's the kind of abrupt, I just have to leave, but in your case, I think what's fascinating is, and it shows up in your person, like, you felt it, but even then 2 years, but building up to the point you couldn't take it anymore. And then you've got your thing. And it's very moving as well. And I think it's also something maybe we weren't fully explored maybe, but like that you've sustained it. The other, I think, thing that can happen is people kind of have it, but then whether variety of things come along, they kind of revert. But sustaining it and the joy that I can feel in your sharing about what you're doing and the amazing work for listeners of Sloww, if you haven't come across it before, go check it out. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing for today, about the extraordinary path that you're taking, or any tips, or not tips, like suggestions? Like, what would you share as parting words for someone listening?
Yeah, I think the most general advice that I could share is to just start questioning. So instead of, people ask sometimes, like, if you could only put one thing on a billboard, what would it be? Or if all your work got destroyed except for one thing, what would you want to leave with people? And I'm like, I don't think I could leave like a statement or a singular piece of advice. It would almost just be to start questioning. And that includes questioning anything and everything, but especially questioning yourself, your own mind. And it is that ultimate self-inquiry question of who am I? So even if you ask the question, who am I? And you just start with the things that I started with in terms of, oh, I'm my job title, my resume, my salary, my net worth, all these different, things that are pretty typical in the socialized, conditioned West of the like achiever mindset. That is a great place to start because what happens is that opens the door in your mind to go deeper. And then you get into ever deeper questioning, and it just goes deeper and deeper, deeper. But instead of it feeling like a struggle or suffering or things like a crisis like I had on the outset, it feels like more of an unfolding or an emergence or listening to life. It's more of a joyful questioning than a suffering questioning or a traumatic questioning. So the questioning can come from a different place, even in itself. So I would just kind of leave people with that in terms of just start questioning and seeing where it leads you. Um, and you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised at where life takes you. Like I said, I could have never guessed this is where life would have taken me if you would have asked me. But here we are.
So yeah, ask that question. Who am I? Who am I? I think Plotinus. Very good. Thank you so much, Kyle. And it's been an absolute joy to have you on the show or on the series. And I look forward to following up.